Welcome, restless dreamer. You've just stepped into the shadows of sleep, where stories whisper and the darkness listens. I'm your guide tonight, your voice in the void, here to lead you gently into nightmares wrapped in lullabies. Before we begin, press like if you're brave enough, and subscribe for more midnight tales that blur the line between sleep and terror. Tell me in the comments, where are you watching from, and what hour has found you? I used to think the old apartment I shared with my roommate was harmless. Just another creaky college rental with thin walls, rattling pipes, and too much character for its own good. I learned fast that buildings like that don't just creak, they breathe. It was a Thursday in October, just after my afternoon lecture. The sky was overcast, the kind of gray that pressed down on you like a weight. I climbed the stairs to our second-floor unit, thinking only about the sandwich I was going to make and the mountain of homework waiting for me. Inside, everything was quiet, too quiet. Usually, the neighbor's television blared through the walls, or the radiators clanged like someone was beating them with a pipe. But that afternoon, silence filled the apartment in a way that felt unnatural. I tossed my bag on the couch and headed for the kitchen. Hunger overrode everything else. The sink was still full of yesterday's dishes, and the stale, musty odor that drifted up from the basement clung to the air. I pulled out some bread, smeared peanut butter on it, and grabbed a Coke. That's when I heard it. The front door opening and closing. Not unusual. My roommate, Mark, sometimes came home between warehouse shifts to grab food or change clothes. He had this habit of never announcing himself, just drifting around like a ghost. I figured it was him, until I remembered one detail that made my skin tighten. Mark was working a double that night. He wasn't supposed to be back until morning. Still, I clung to the thought. Maybe he'd been cut loose early. Maybe I'd mixed up his schedule. Footsteps thudded softly through the living room. The third board from the wall gave its usual squeak, the one both of us knew by heart. "You're home early," I called, but got no reply. Silence answered me. The footsteps shifted toward the hallway, then the bathroom. The rattle of the loose doorknob carried clear and distinct. My hand, sticky with peanut butter, tightened around the butter knife I'd been using. A joke, I told myself. Just my imagination filling in blanks. Then I saw them, Mark's boots. His brown work boots sat by the door, the same pair he wore every single day. If those were still here, then whoever had just walked into the apartment wasn't him. I froze, sandwich in one hand, Coke in the other, my whole body rigid. My brain scrambled for explanations, but there weren't any that made sense. I set the food down carefully on the counter, every sound suddenly magnified. Like the metallic clink of the Coke can against the surface was a gunshot. My phone was in my bag in the living room, too far away. I needed something, anything. My hand found a kitchen knife in the dish rack. My knuckles were already damp with sweat as I gripped it. The smart thing would have been to leave immediately, bolt out the door and call the cops. But my laptop, my wallet, my whole life sat in my bedroom down the hall. Some part of me couldn't walk away. The hallway stretched in front of me like a tunnel. 5 doors total. Bathroom, linen closet, Mark's room, mine at the end, and the laundry room to the right. 4 of them were shut. The laundry room door stood half open, just enough darkness showing through. That's when I heard it. Breathing. Slow, steady, controlled. Not mine. Coming from that gap. My throat tightened. Every instinct screamed to run, but I forced my feet forward. I nudged the door wider with the knife tip, the hinges groaning. He was there. A man crouched low between the washer and dryer, a crowbar balanced across his knees like it belonged there. He wore a faded denim jacket, mud-caked work pants, and scuffed yellow boots. His hair was graying at the temples, his face weathered like he'd spent his life outdoors. But what unsettled me most were his eyes. Pale blue, too pale, and they didn't blink enough. He looked at me calmly, as though I'd interrupted him tying his shoes. The crowbar glinted in the dim light, scratches running along its length. Rust clung to the curve, or maybe it was dried blood. "Hey there," he said casually, voice calm, almost neighborly. My grip tightened on the knife. He rose slowly to his feet, not in a rush, not startled. The crowbar hung low at his side, not raised but never lowering either. "Real sorry about this," he said, his tone rehearsed. "Lady at the rental office told me this unit was empty. I thought I'd take a look around before the showing tomorrow." His words slid out smooth like he'd practiced them. But everything about them was wrong. Mrs. Novak had lived downstairs for years. The rental office wasn't showing anything here. He was lying, and the way he angled his body told me he was blocking something behind him. I leaned slightly, just enough to see around him. My stomach dropped. Our toolbox was open on the floor. My roommate's drill, a wrench set, even a box of detergent pods, our things, already stacked like loot ready to go. "You should leave," I said, surprising myself with how steady my voice came out. His lips twitched into the faintest smile, just a small upturn that froze my chest. "Sure thing, kid. Just a misunderstanding." But he didn't leave. He shifted closer, his boot scraping softly against the linoleum. The crowbar brushed against my leg as he passed, the metal cold through my jeans. His calmness made it worse. Predators don't rush. They linger. They study. At the front door he paused. "Nice place you got here," he said, glancing around our living room like he was memorizing it. His eyes locked with mine one last time before he stepped outside. "You should really lock your door. Anybody could walk in." The door clicked shut. I stood frozen in the hallway, knife trembling in my hand, my heart hammering so loud I thought it would echo through the walls. Through the peephole, I watched him light a cigarette, standing on the sidewalk in broad daylight like he owned the street. He didn't leave right away. He just stood there, staring up at our window. Then he walked slowly to a van parked across the street, a white Ford with its paint peeling and a logo too faded to read. He sat there for nearly 10 minutes before finally driving off. I didn't breathe until the sound of the engine faded. I bolted the door, slid the chain across, then dragged a chair under the knob just for good measure. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. Every muscle in my body screamed at me to call someone, but my phone was still in the living room, lying uselessly by my backpack. When I finally grabbed it, my fingers fumbled over the keypad so badly, I had to punch the numbers twice before they connected. The dispatcher's calm voice was an anchor. Within 15 minutes, 2 officers were at my door. The older one, gray streaking his hair, spoke while the younger officer snapped photos of the laundry room. They pointed out the fresh scratch marks on the lock where the crowbar had worked its way in. I hadn't even noticed. "You're lucky," the older officer said. "Most of the time, guys like that don't leave so easy." They bagged a few things for evidence, including fingerprints from the crowbar and the knob. No guarantees, they warned. Unless he was in the system, it might not lead anywhere. When Mark came home later, he went pale at the sight of police in the apartment, while double-checking every window, every lock. Neither of us slept that night. We shoved the couch against the door. He stayed in the living room with a bat, while I locked myself in my room, wedging a chair under the handle. Every radiator clang, every creak in the ceiling sent us both on edge. Days turned into weeks, but the fear didn't fade. We installed new deadbolts, bought alarms, even put up a cheap security camera above the door, but safety felt like an illusion. And then, one afternoon, Mark called me from work, his voice thin and tight. "Check the news," he said. I did, and there he was, the man with the crowbar. His pale eyes stared out from a mugshot, bruised and swollen but unmistakable. His name was Gregory Fulton, 50 years old, arrested 2 towns over after breaking into a house where the owner happened to be home with a gun. He survived, but barely. The search of his van turned up stolen property from dozens of homes. Among them, Mark's drill with his initials carved into the handle. The news said he'd targeted college neighborhoods specifically. Students were careless, predictable, unarmed, easy prey. That night, we both realized how close we'd come. If I'd hesitated, if I'd turned my back, if he'd decided to swing instead of smile, my story would have ended differently. We moved soon after, into a building with security cameras, a doorman, and locks that clicked shut automatically. But even there, I found myself checking them twice before bed, sometimes 3 times, because the truth is, locks only keep people out if they want to stay out, and I can still see those pale blue eyes, unblinking, calculating, watching. When my parents first told me we were moving into the townhouse on Hawthorne Lane, I didn't think much of it. I was 15, and moving felt like one more annoyance piled on top of high school stress. My mom called the place cozy. My dad bragged that it was a good investment. I just saw a beige row of homes pressed tightly together, with postage-stamp lawns and squeaky front gates. The house itself wasn't bad. 2 floors, a small kitchen, and a living room that smelled faintly of paint and carpet glue. My bedroom was upstairs at the end of the hall, tucked right under the slope of the roof. It had one of those ceilings that slanted down in a way that made the room feel smaller. Above it was the attic, a crawl space accessible through a square panel in the hallway ceiling. I hated that attic panel from the first night. It sat directly across from my door, like a dark little mouth waiting to open. The first time I heard the noise, I thought it was the house settling. A faint thump, then a dragging sound, like something shifting weight. I was unpacking books onto my shelf when it happened, and I froze, listening. The noise came from directly above me, faint but deliberate. I called out for my dad. He came up, flashlight in hand, and poked his head into the crawl space. "Just insulation and dust," he said, climbing down after a few minutes. "You'll get used to the sounds. Houses breathe." But it didn't feel like breathing. That night, lying in bed, I kept hearing it. Scratches, a shuffle, a hollow knock that traveled down the beams. Every sound made my chest tighten. I pulled my blanket over my head, telling myself it was just my imagination. But my imagination was loud. By the 3rd night, I wasn't sleeping much. Every time I closed my eyes, something stirred above me, like a restless animal pacing. I mentioned it at breakfast, but my mom only smiled tightly and said, "Old houses always sound alive." Alive. The word stuck with me. A week into living there, I started noticing other things. My bedroom door would be cracked open in the morning, though I always shut it before bed. My desk chair would be angled slightly away from the desk, like someone had sat in it. Once, I found the curtains drawn open, even though I distinctly remembered pulling them shut before leaving for school. I tried to tell myself I was being paranoid. Maybe I hadn't closed things as tightly as I thought. Maybe I was just distracted. But a part of me, the part that listened to the noises above my ceiling, knew I wasn't wrong. Then came the whisper. It wasn't a voice exactly, more like a hushed breath filtering through the vent above my bed. I was half asleep when I heard it. Soft, fragmented, almost like words but too faint to catch. My eyes shot open, and I stared at the vent, waiting. The sound stopped, leaving me clutching my blanket and shaking. The next morning, I dragged a chair into the hallway, climbed up, and pushed at the attic panel. It swung upward with a reluctant creak, releasing a gust of stale, dusty air. The opening yawned above me, nothing visible except dark beams and fiberglass insulation. I didn't have the nerve to climb inside. I told myself I'd ask my dad to check again, but I didn't. Something in me didn't want to know what was really up there. One Saturday afternoon, while my parents were downstairs, I heard it again, this time loud enough to leave no doubt. A distinct shuffle of knees or feet dragging across the attic floor, right above my bed. Heart pounding, I grabbed my phone and recorded the sound. The audio picked it up clearly. Scratching, then a dull knock. I showed it to my dad that evening. He frowned, replaying the recording. "Could be a raccoon," he said finally. "Or a squirrel. We'll call pest control." But pest control found nothing. No droppings, no nesting, no signs of entry, the man said, shrugging. You're critter-free. I wanted to believe him. That night, as I lay awake, the sound came back, slow, measured, like someone deliberately crawling. I pressed a pillow over my head, trying to block it out. Just as I started to drift, I felt it, a faint vibration through the ceiling plaster, as though someone had shifted their weight and settled directly above me. I didn't sleep at all. The next morning, I noticed something new, a small gray smear on the edge of the attic panel, like a fingerprint made of dust and grease. That's when the thought first entered my head, sharp and unwelcome. What if it isn't an animal at all? I didn't tell my parents this time. They already thought I was overreacting. But the more I watched, the more I noticed. My water bottle would be half empty when I woke up, though I never touched it. My closet door, which I always left open, would be shut tight some mornings. Little things, small enough to doubt, until they added up. One night I was brushing my teeth when I caught movement in the bathroom mirror. Behind me, down the hall, the attic panel swayed gently, as if it had just been pushed shut. I dropped my toothbrush. The rest of the night, I sat awake in my room, staring at that panel, waiting for it to move again. It didn't, but by then I was certain. Someone was living above us. The police officers were gone by the time dusk folded over the townhouse, their heavy boots and murmured reassurances fading like the hum of a storm passing through. My parents tried to act calm, but I could see the unease tightening their shoulders. Mom kept busy in the kitchen, clattering dishes unnecessarily, while Dad made a show of checking locks and latches, even though the officers had already done that twice. I sat on the couch, knees drawn up, staring at the ceiling. The attic door seemed heavier now, as though it pressed down on me through the roof. Even with the authorities gone, I felt like the house itself had been cracked open, revealing something I couldn't unsee. That night, no one wanted to be alone. Mom suggested we all sleep in the living room, just for tonight. We dragged blankets and pillows downstairs, arranging them in a makeshift camp. Dad left a lamp on in the corner, casting a pale cone of light across the room. But lying there, staring at the ceiling fan slowly turning, I couldn't sleep. Every sound above us seemed magnified. The creak of wood, the shifting of insulation, the sigh of old beams. It all felt deliberate. At some point, I must have dozed off, because I woke with a start to the sound of something faint, the quiet drag of a footstep above. My heart jumped into my throat. I turned toward Dad, who was snoring softly beside me. I thought about shaking him awake, but the sound stopped before I could move. The next morning, Dad brushed it off. "The house is old," he said, rubbing his eyes. "Wood expands at night. Don't spook yourself." But I knew what I heard. Over the next week, I started noticing small things. Items in my room weren't where I'd left them. A book slightly out of place on my shelf. My hairbrush angled differently on the desk. Mom insisted I was just forgetting, but the feeling of being observed became unbearable. One afternoon, I came home from school before anyone else. The house was quiet, still. I went to my room and froze. My closet door was ajar. I never left it that way. Slowly, I crossed the floor and pushed the door open. Inside, everything was neat, except for a faint smell, musty and sour like damp clothes. I backed out quickly, every nerve alive. That night, I couldn't hold it in anymore. What if he never left? I asked my parents. Mom frowned. "Honey, don't say that. The police didn't find anyone. You're scaring yourself." But Dad hesitated before answering. That hesitation said everything. 2 nights later, I woke to another sound. Not footsteps. Breathing. Shallow, uneven, right above my bed. My eyes flew open, staring at the ceiling. I clutched the blanket and listened. It lasted maybe 30 seconds before it stopped, but it was enough. I knew I hadn't imagined it. Someone was still there. The next day, I begged Dad to go back into the attic. He resisted at first, but finally agreed, more to appease me than anything else. He pulled the ladder down and climbed up with a flashlight. I stood at the base, holding my breath. When he came back down, his face was pale. There's food wrappers and a blanket, fresh ones, Mom gasped. But the police cleared it. They must have missed it. His voice was low, tight, or he came back. That night, we didn't sleep in the living room. Dad insisted we stay at a motel, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. If the intruder had been there all along, then he'd been moving silently through the walls, the crawl space, slipping in and out without us noticing, watching us, watching me. At the motel, I lay awake, picturing the small attic hatch, the narrow beams, the shadows where someone could crouch and wait. My skin prickled at the thought of eyes following me from above while I slept. We moved out of the townhouse within a month. My parents didn't say it outright, but the decision was quick, almost frantic. Boxes filled overnight, and soon the place was empty again. But even after leaving, the feeling hasn't gone. At night, when I lie in bed in our new house, I sometimes catch myself listening too hard, waiting for a creak, a breath. Because the worst part isn't knowing that someone was up there. The worst part is never finding him. Somewhere out there he's still watching. Maybe not from an attic anymore. Maybe from closer than I think. And sometimes, when I wake suddenly in the night, I swear I can feel that same, slow, deliberate breathing. Not in the ceiling this time, in the room. I never thought my interest in forgotten places would lead me to something I couldn't explain. Photography had always been my escape, my way of freezing quiet moments into something lasting. I wasn't chasing beauty the way most photographers did. I was chasing silence, abandonment, decay. Places where the world had already turned its back, leaving behind echoes and shadows that only a camera could catch. That's how I ended up at the old grain mill just outside town. Everyone called it the Red Mill, though the paint had long since peeled to a chalky rust color. It had been abandoned for decades, shut down after a collapse in the lower storage floors killed 3 workers. Nobody wanted to touch it after that. People said it was unsafe, unstable, a liability waiting to happen. But that was exactly the kind of place that called to me. I drove out late in the afternoon with my camera bag strapped over my shoulder and my tripod rattling in the back seat. The mill sat in the middle of an overgrown field, weeds crawling waist-high in places. Its broken windows reflected what little sun remained, jagged shards glinting like watchful eyes. Inside, the air was heavy with dust. Each step stirred up years of silence. Wooden beams groaned overhead, and the floorboards beneath me gave uncertain sighs. I set up my camera in the main hall, where the conveyor belts once fed grain through enormous chutes. The machinery stood frozen in place, rusted but still hulking like skeletal remains of something that once breathed. I snapped the first few shots, angles of collapsing staircases, broken tiles scattered like teeth across the floor. The light was dying fast, bleeding orange across the jagged holes in the walls. Perfect for the kind of mood I wanted. That's when I saw it. Not with my eyes at first. Through the lens. I adjusted my camera toward one of the tall windows, aiming to capture the way the sunlight streaked across a rusted pipe. But in the corner of the frame, just at the edge of focus, a shape stood against the wall. It was pale, almost blending with the washed-out paint, and blurred like a smear of water on glass. I lowered the camera. The corner was empty. Just shadows and peeling wallpaper. I raised it again. The shape was still there, closer now, faintly outlined against the crackling plaster. I blinked, my chest tightening. What the hell? I muttered under my breath. I pulled the camera away again. Empty wall. I told myself it was a trick of light, maybe the reflection of my own movement. I shook it off, set the camera to continuous shots, and snapped a full series. Click, click, click. When I scrolled through them, my stomach knotted. The figure wasn't just in one shot. It appeared in several, each time nearer. First barely a blur against the far wall, then directly beside a column, hazy, but undeniable. Finally, standing just behind me, its outline faint, but its presence unmistakable. I dropped the camera strap from my neck. my heart pounding against my ribs. I spun around, the tripod legs scraping harshly on the floor. Nothing, just the vast empty hall, dust swirling in the amber light. I told myself to calm down. Old buildings creak, shadows shift. I had been staring through a lens too long, letting my mind invent things. But as I packed up, the silence grew heavier. I felt it pressing on me, as if the mill itself was listening. The last rays of daylight slipped away, and the interior sank into a darker shade of gray. My breath felt too loud, my footsteps too deliberate. On impulse, I lifted the camera again, pointing it toward the doorway I was heading for. And there it was, not faint anymore, not blurred, a figure, pale as milk, standing in the threshold. Its face was wrong, not blank, not detailed, just smeared, as if someone had dragged wet paint across it. I froze. My mouth went dry. I dropped the camera and ran. Outside, the air felt like water after drowning. I staggered toward my car, refusing to look back. My fingers fumbled with the keys, the door lock clumsy under my panic. When I finally started the engine, the headlights flared across the mill's facade. Every broken window stared back at me like black eyes. I drove home shaking, every shadow in the rearview mirror thick with imagined shapes. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the photos. I should have deleted them. I knew I should, but my curiosity was stronger than my fear. I plugged the memory card into my laptop, my heart thudding as the files loaded. One by one, the images appeared. The shape was always there, always closer. In the final frame, taken just before I dropped the camera, it stood at my shoulder. So close I could see the pale curve of its head against mine. Its face was pressed near, blurred and wet-looking, as though it had been smeared across the lens itself. I slammed the laptop shut, bile rising in my throat, but the reflection stayed in my mind, burned into me. And later, as I passed the mirror in my hallway, I swore I saw it again, just for a second, standing too close. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind pressing against the shutters, every groan in the old wood set me on edge. My eyes burned from exhaustion, but closing them felt like inviting something in. I sat in the armchair facing the door, the camera still in my lap. The black smudge on the developed film haunted me. I couldn't shake the thought that it had been standing right outside. When dawn finally pushed through the curtains, pale and thin, I thought maybe things would feel normal again. Sunlight has a way of chasing shadows out of your head. But when I stepped outside onto the porch, my stomach sank. There were footprints, not mine. They started at the tree line and ended right at the cabin steps, a pair of deep impressions in the damp soil. Human-shaped but longer, like the heel stretched too far. The prints stopped dead at the base of the porch, as if someone, or something, had been standing there for hours, watching. I went back inside and locked the door, even though I knew a lock on a weather-beaten cabin door wouldn't keep much out. The rest of the day blurred by in a haze of pacing, checking windows and making sure the fire hadn't died. I tried to convince myself that I was just scaring myself, that maybe a hunter had wandered close. But no hunter stands silently outside a cabin all night without knocking, without announcing himself. That night, the whispering started. It wasn't loud at first, just a faint rustle, like leaves scraping against the glass. I pressed my ear to the wall, and the sound sharpened. Murmurs, voices too faint to make out, but too deliberate to be the wind. They circled the cabin, weaving through the cracks in the wood like smoke. I shoved a pillow over my head, but it didn't help. The whispers weren't outside anymore. They were in the room with me, drifting over my shoulders, brushing the back of my neck. At some point, I must have passed out, because I woke to silence and the gray light of morning. My throat was raw, as if I'd been screaming. That was when I decided I couldn't stay. I threw my things into my bag and stepped out to the truck, praying it would start. The air was heavy, pressing down on me, and the trees seemed taller, darker, as if they were leaning closer. When I reached the truck, I froze. The windshield was covered in handprints, dozens of them, some large, some small, pressed against the glass in overlapping smears. Each palm mark looked wet, as though they'd just been made. My keys trembled in my hands. I forced myself into the driver's seat and jammed the key into the ignition. The engine coughed once, then died. I tried again. Nothing. I didn't wait. I grabbed my bag and bolted back inside the cabin, slamming the door shut behind me. My heart pounded so loud it drowned out every other sound. I didn't know what else to do but wait for daylight again. The whispers returned that night, louder this time. They weren't content to linger outside. They filled every corner of the cabin, sliding beneath the door, curling up from the floorboards, seeping from the chimney like smoke. I pressed my hands over my ears until my nails dug into my scalp, but the voices slid past the barrier, and then, through the jumble of whispers, one voice separated from the rest. A low murmur, almost familiar. It said my name. I staggered back against the wall, shaking my head violently. I hadn't told anyone I was here. No one knew except the friend who'd offered me the cabin. Yet the voice came again, clearer this time, calling my name with a calm, coaxing tone. Open the door, it whispered. The knob rattled. Once, twice. I stared at it, frozen in place, every nerve screaming for me not to move. The wood groaned, the hinges shuddered, but somehow the door held. When morning finally came, I found the knob slick with condensation, as though a hand had clung there all night waiting. By the third day, I was losing it. My food was nearly gone, my phone dead, and the truck useless. My thoughts spun in jagged circles, breaking apart and reforming in ways that didn't make sense. I couldn't tell if I was awake or dreaming. Shadows stretched too long in the corners. The sound of someone breathing followed me from room to room. That night, I made a mistake. I snapped. As the whispers rose, I screamed back at them, hurling curses into the dark. I slammed my fists against the walls, demanding they show themselves. The cabin shook with the force of my rage, and for a moment, the voices fell silent. Then they laughed. The sound was wrong. Too many voices in unison, overlapping, echoing. They laughed until the cabin itself seemed to tremble, until the glass in the windows rattled and the fire guttered out. And then I saw it. In the corner of the room, just past the firelight, something shifted, tall, blacker than the shadows around it, with the faint outline of arms too long, fingers brushing the floorboards. The head bent low, almost touching the ceiling. I couldn't see its face, but I felt its eyes, heavy and deliberate, locking onto me. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The only sound was its slow, scraping inhale, as though it were tasting the air. And then, darkness. I woke up sprawled on the floor, the fire dead and cold, the cabin silent. I don't know how long I'd been out. My head ached, and when I touched my temple I found dried blood crusted beneath my hairline. The thing was gone, or maybe it hadn't been there at all. Now, as I sit writing this by the last bit of daylight, I know I don't have much time left. My food is gone, my strength fading. Every night the thing comes closer. Every morning the footprints press deeper into the soil. If anyone finds this, if anyone reads these words, don't come here. Don't look for me. The cabin doesn't want to let me go, and I don't think it will. I never thought much about the way shadows linger in photographs. To me, photography was just a medium of capturing stillness, frames of life that most people walked past without noticing. That's why I chose it as my major in college. I wanted to reveal what was always there but rarely seen. When my professor assigned us a project to explore urban decay, I immediately thought of the abandoned rail yard on the edge of town. I had passed it countless times on the bus. Its crumbling brick walls, half-toppled lampposts, and rows of rusting freight cars. The yard was fenced off with warning signs, but that only made it more enticing. I went there at dusk, when the sun was sinking behind the skeletal remains of the old water tower. The place was silent, except for the low hum of insects, and the occasional groan of shifting metal as the temperature dropped. The perfect atmosphere for what I wanted. I carried my Nikon, a tripod, and a roll of black and white film. Digital felt too clean for a place like this. The air smelled of rust and damp earth, and every step crunched on broken glass. I found angles quickly, graffiti-stained walls, a collapsed loading dock, a row of doors hanging from their hinges. It wasn't until I developed the first roll that I noticed something was wrong. In the photograph of the water tower, a pale figure was standing in the shadows at its base. At first I thought it was just an effect of the light, maybe an overexposure, but the figure had definition. It looked like a person, long, thin arms, a torso too narrow to be natural, and a face blurred as though it was smeared across the emulsion. I didn't remember anyone being there. The yard had felt completely deserted. I brushed it off, told myself I was imagining things. But then I developed the next frame, an image of the freight cars lined in a row. The figure was there again, closer this time, standing between two cars, half hidden, its face still blurred. My stomach tightened. By the third photo, it was undeniable. The figure was no longer distant. It stood just behind me, its outline distinct in the glass reflection of the loading dock doors. And yet I was alone. I knew I had been alone. I deleted the images from my digital backup. The negatives, though, I couldn't bring myself to throw them away. Something about them felt important, even though they terrified me. That night, when I tried to sleep, I felt as though my room was smaller somehow, compressed at the edges. I kept glancing at the corner near my desk where my camera bag rested. My laptop, still open, flickered with its screensaver. At one point, I thought I saw movement in its reflection, just a shadow shifting behind me. I turned quickly. Nothing. Still, my skin prickled. The next morning I convinced myself it was just fatigue. I had pulled too many late nights in the darkroom. I packed my gear again and returned to the rail yard. I told myself I would reshoot, and this time I would prove there was nothing there. But as soon as I stepped through the fence, the air felt wrong, heavier, like I was walking underwater. I set up my tripod and began snapping shots. The freight cars, the tower, the broken windows of the office building. I worked fast, trying not to think about the way the silence pressed against my ears. Then, as I adjusted the focus on my lens, I felt it. Breath, warm and steady, brushing the back of my neck. I spun around, my heart hammering. The yard was empty. The only movement came from a loose strip of sheet metal clanging against the wind. I packed up and left, faster than I cared to admit. That night, when I developed the new roll, my hands shook so badly I almost ruined the film. But the images were worse than before. The figure wasn't distant anymore. It was closer, leaning in from the edge of the frame, its face still smeared like wet paint. In one photo, its arm seemed to extend forward, reaching not toward the scene, but toward the camera itself. And in the final frame, it stood behind me, not just in the reflection this time, behind me, its face inches from mine, blurred but unmistakable. I stared at that print until my eyes ached. My chest tightened with a pressure I couldn't name, because in that image, my own expression had changed. I looked afraid, but I didn't remember being afraid when I took it. I stopped going to the rail yard after that. I told myself the project was done, that I had enough material to turn in. But the truth was, I couldn't bring myself to go back. Still, the figure followed me. It started small, reflections in windows, always just behind my shoulder, glimpses in the dark corners of my apartment. Once, when I was brushing my teeth, I caught sight of something pale in the mirror, leaning just inside the doorway. When I turned, the bathroom was empty. The next day, I found one of the prints I had torn up lying on my desk, perfectly intact, smooth, uncreased, as though I had never destroyed it. I threw it in the trash outside, buried under coffee grounds and old takeout containers. The following morning, it was back on my desk again, clean, dry, the pale figure staring from the background. I barely slept after that. Every creak of the apartment made me jolt upright. My neighbors must have thought I was losing it, the way I paced the halls at night. I considered getting rid of the negatives, but part of me was afraid of what might happen if I tried. It felt like the figure wanted me to, as though destroying them would invite something worse. The breaking point came one evening while I was working on a paper. I had the photo prints stacked in a folder, shoved to the far end of the desk. My laptop camera light flicked on by itself. I froze. The small green glow stared at me, unblinking. And then, on the screen, I saw it. Not just behind me, next to me. Its pale, blurred face almost brushing against my own. I slammed the laptop shut so hard the screen cracked. My heart pounded against my ribs, my mouth dry with panic. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't sleep the next either. My apartment felt suffocating, every corner watching me. Finally, I packed the negatives, the prints, even the camera, into a shoebox and drove out of town. I didn't have a plan. I just drove, past gas stations and shuttered motels, until I reached a remote stretch of highway where the woods pressed close to the road. I pulled over and carried the box deep into the trees. My legs shook the whole way. I set the box down, doused it with lighter fluid from a camping kit, and struck a match. The fire caught quickly, curling the edges of the photographs, warping the film. For a moment, relief washed over me. But then, in the smoke, I saw it. Not on paper this time, not in glass, in the fire itself. The same pale, blurred face, watching from the curling black smoke, its head tilting as if curious. I stumbled back, tripped over roots, and ran until I burst back onto the empty highway. I drove home with shaking hands, barely able to keep the car straight. When I finally returned to my apartment, I opened the door and froze. The shoebox was sitting on my bed, untouched. I can't explain what's happening anymore. I don't know if the figure is real, if it crawled out of those photographs, or if I've simply gone mad. All I know is that every time I look through a lens, or catch myself reflected in glass, it's closer. And tonight, I don't need the camera to see it. It's standing in the corner of my room, watching. I used to think I knew my neighborhood inside and out. The cracked sidewalks, the bent basketball hoops, the flickering street lamps, all of it felt ordinary, safe in its familiarity. That's why the night it happened still sticks in my chest like a lodged shard of glass. Ordinary places don't usually turn on you. Ordinary streets aren't supposed to feel like traps. That evening had been like so many before it. I stayed late at the park, shooting hoops until the sun slid behind the rooftops and the whole block was tinted in dusky orange. I remember the sound of my sneakers scraping against the uneven blacktop, the hollow bounce of the ball echoing in the cooling air. Nothing strange, nothing out of place. But on my walk home, I noticed something that froze me mid-step. A car. It was a faded blue sedan, the kind that looked like it had seen too many winters and too many repair jobs. At first, I didn't think much of it. Cars cut through our neighborhood all the time. But this one didn't pass. It crawled, slow, deliberate. Its headlights were dimmed low, and when I looked back a few minutes later, there it was again, creeping around the block like it had all the time in the world. I tried to brush it off, told myself maybe the driver was lost. But when I turned left, the sedan turned left. When I cut across the street, its wheels whispered along behind me. The driver's hand was on the wheel, long fingers tapping lightly in a rhythm that made my stomach twist. His face was hidden in shadow, but I knew. His eyes were on me. By the time I reached my street, the air felt heavier than usual, as if the night itself had thickened. Every house looked the same, tidy lawns, trimmed hedges, but they felt strange, foreign, like I'd stepped onto a stage set where the audience was just waiting for something terrible to unfold. I quickened my pace, sneakers slapping against the pavement, and when I finally stepped into my driveway, I let out a shaky breath. Safe, or so I thought. I closed the front door behind me, flicked on the living room lamp, and out of habit, peeked through the blinds. My blood went cold. The sedan was still there. It glided slowly back down the street, then stopped at the corner, idling at the stop sign like it had nowhere else to go. The hum of its engine seemed to seep through the glass, vibrating faintly against my chest. My mom was at work, my dad on a night shift, my brother at a friend's house. I was completely, utterly alone. For a while, I tried to drown it out. I turned on the TV, cranked the volume, even loaded up a video game to distract myself. But every few minutes, I'd creep back to the blinds, my breath fogging the thin slats. Sometimes the car was gone. Other times, it was back, parked across the street with the engine running. The longer it stayed, the more unreal it felt. Why my house? Why me? I tried to act like someone else was home. I clattered dishes in the sink, stomped down the hallway, even spoke out loud as though I was carrying on a conversation. It was a dumb trick, something I'd read about in some survival story, but the thought of that driver knowing I was alone made my skin crawl. But when I peeked again, he hadn't moved. Only the soft glow of a cigarette tip flickered through the windshield, like a tiny burning eye in the dark. I pulled back from the window, heart racing. Every sound in the house was amplified. The hum of the fridge, the ticking of the clock, the faint creak of floorboards under my feet. But underneath it all, steady and patient, was the low growl of the car's engine. At one point, I thought I saw the driver's side door crack open. Just an inch. My throat went dry. I grabbed the phone, fingers hovering over the buttons, but I couldn't bring myself to dial. What would I even say? There's a car outside. I could already hear the skepticism in a dispatcher's voice. Kids overreact. Kids imagine things. The phone rang suddenly, jolting me so hard I nearly dropped it. For a moment I thought, irrationally, that it was him, that somehow the man in the car had found my number. But when the answering machine picked up, it was just my brother, saying he'd be staying over at his friend's another night. I whispered, "No," into the empty air, as if he could hear me. The words sounded small and desperate, swallowed by the house that suddenly felt too big, too empty, and too thin to keep anything out. I turned off the lights. Bad idea. The glow of the TV became a beacon against the window. I swore I could feel him seeing exactly where I stood, exactly where I breathed. I pressed myself against the hallway wall, trembling, ears straining, and then silence. The hum of the engine stopped. At first, relief washed over me. Maybe he'd left. Maybe he was finally gone. But then the silence stretched on, thick and suffocating, and a new thought struck me like a lightning bolt. What if he'd turned off the car to approach on foot? I pressed my ear against the door. Nothing. Just my own heartbeat, thundering in my ears. My palms were slick with sweat. Every nerve screamed at me to move, to hide, to run. But my legs were stiff, glued to the spot. I don't know how long I stood there, locked in that awful silence. Finally, I forced myself to the phone and dialed my mom at work. My voice came out in a broken rush, every word tumbling over the next. "There's a car. It's been outside for hours. He's watching me. Mom, please." She didn't tell me to calm down. She didn't brush it off. Instead, her voice dropped into a tone I'd never heard before. Sharp, urgent, commanding. "Lock every door. Stay away from the windows. I'm calling the police." That's when it hit me. This wasn't just paranoia. This was real. Minutes later, red and blue lights washed over the street outside my window. The sedan jerked forward like the driver had been caught off guard. For a moment I thought he'd make a run for it, but the cruiser blocked the exit at the end of the block. I could only watch from between the blinds as officers approached, flashlights cutting into the shadowed interior. I held my breath. The engine finally cut off, leaving the night eerily still. From my narrow view through the blinds, the whole scene played out like some half-real movie. Flashlight beams carved across the sedan's windows, glinting off dull metal. One officer rested a hand on his holster, while the other leaned close to peer inside. I pressed my forehead against the wall beside the window, straining to hear. My pulse was pounding so loud it drowned out nearly everything else. Then, for the first time all night, the car door opened. The driver stepped out slowly, almost reluctantly, like he hadn't expected this moment to come. Even at a distance, I could see how tall he was. Shoulders slouched forward, hands shoved deep into the pockets of his jacket. His face was half hidden by the brim of a baseball cap, but the way he moved, too calm, too practiced, made my stomach twist. The officer said something I couldn't make out. He raised his hands just enough to show they were empty. Then, without warning, he laughed. It wasn't loud. It wasn't manic, but it carried. Even muffled through the glass, it sent a cold rush up my spine. It wasn't the laugh of someone caught making a mistake. It was the laugh of someone who didn't think he'd done anything wrong at all. They patted him down, asked questions, checked his pockets. I thought for sure they'd haul him away. But after a few tense minutes, one officer began writing something down, while the other gestured toward the end of the street. The man nodded slowly, like he understood perfectly, and then slid back into his car. No handcuffs, no arrest, just released. My throat tightened. I wanted to scream at them through the window. He's been here for hours. He followed me, he's watching. But my voice wouldn't work. I watched in numb disbelief as the sedan rolled past my house one last time. The driver turned his head slightly toward my window as he passed, and for the briefest second, our eyes met. Even in the blur of headlights and shadow, I'll never forget the look he gave me. A faint smile, the kind that said, "This isn't over." The police car trailed him down the block until both vanished into the night. The silence that followed was worse than any engine hum. When the officer finally knocked on my door, I nearly jumped out of my skin. I cracked it open just wide enough to see his face, calm, practiced, like he'd done this routine 100 times. He asked a few questions. Had the man spoken to me? Tried to approach? Had I ever seen him before? I stumbled through my answers, still shaking. He nodded, scribbled on his notepad, then said words that rattled around my brain for weeks after. "He won't be back tonight. Try to get some rest." That was it. No details, no explanation. Just a pat reassurance, like I was some scared kid imagining monsters. But I wasn't imagining. Not this time. When my mom came home, she hugged me so tight I couldn't breathe. We stayed up until dawn, the glow of the TV flickering weakly in the corner. Neither of us talked much. Neither of us needed to. The silence between us said everything. We both knew this wasn't over, no matter what the officer had promised. The next morning, the street looked completely ordinary again. Kids rode bikes past my driveway. A delivery truck rumbled by. Neighbors watered their lawns. The sedan was gone, but its shadow lingered. Every time a car slowed near the curb, my chest seized up. Every time headlights swept across the blinds at night, I braced for that hum to start again. Days turned into weeks, and I never saw the faded blue sedan again. But the damage was done. The block never felt the same. The park, my park, felt tainted. Every squeak of the swing set, every thud of a basketball, carried an echo of that night. I couldn't walk home without glancing over my shoulder a dozen times. I couldn't sit in my own living room without checking the blinds, half expecting to see that glowing ember of a cigarette staring back at me. I never found out who he was. The police never told us if he had a record, if he'd been caught stalking others, or if he just drove away into the night to find someone else. That was the part that gnawed at me the most, not knowing. Because people like that don't just vanish. Sometimes, late at night, I'll wake to the faintest sound outside. A car idling a little too long, tires crunching slowly over gravel. My pulse spikes. My throat closes. I creep to the blinds, hold my breath, and peek through the narrowest slat. Most of the time it's nothing. A neighbor, a passing stranger, just life moving on. But once, just once, I swear I saw it again. That same shape, that same dull glow behind the windshield. parked just far enough down the street to make me question myself. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and it was gone. Or maybe it hadn't been there at all. I don't know which possibility scares me more. I never thought my photography class would push me into places no one else dared to go. When my professor assigned us a project to capture the spirit of abandonment, I knew most of my classmates would flock to the same tired locations: graffiti-filled warehouses, half-collapsed barns, empty parking garages. But I wanted something more unusual, something that carried a kind of weight when you looked at it. That's why I ended up standing at the rusted gates of the old railway yard on the edge of town. The place had been shut down for decades, ever since a derailment killed several workers and nearly bankrupted the company. Most people in town avoided it. They said it was cursed ground, a place that had absorbed too much grief. I told myself those were just stories, but I'd be lying if I said my hands weren't shaking as I pulled the camera strap over my shoulder. The yard stretched out like a graveyard of steel and wood. Rotting train cars leaned against each other, their paint peeled away in strips, their windows shattered. The iron rails were rusted, disappearing into the tall grass as if the earth itself was trying to bury them. The air smelled of damp moss and something metallic that clung to the back of my throat. I walked further in, the crunch of gravel beneath my boots sounding too loud in the stillness. Every time I paused to take a photo, the silence felt heavy, as though the whole yard was holding its breath. My camera clicked, capturing beams of fading sunlight cutting through broken windows, rust drips staining the sides of cars, vines curling like skeletal fingers through gaps in the wood. That's when I noticed the first one. In the viewfinder, at the far end of the frame, a figure stood. Not close, just far enough away that I couldn't make out details. My heart stuttered, but when I lowered the camera, the space was empty. I blinked, looked again. Nothing but old tracks and weeds. I told myself it was a trick of the lens, maybe the shadow of a bent signpost. But unease had already crept in, settling under my skin like static. I moved on, forcing myself to keep shooting. The second time it happened, I nearly dropped the camera. I was photographing the inside of a gutted passenger car, the kind with rows of wooden seats long since broken and rotted. In the photo preview, I saw something in the aisle, a pale figure, blurred, as though the camera had caught motion. It was standing, facing me, just a little too close. I whipped around, but the aisle was empty. My pulse hammered in my ears. "Calm down," I muttered to myself, gripping the camera tighter. "It's just an effect, long exposure or something. Nothing's there." But my own voice sounded strange in the emptiness, like it didn't belong. By the time the sun began to dip below the horizon, I had almost convinced myself I was imagining things. The creeping dusk turned everything a shade of blue-gray, and I told myself I'd get one last wide shot of the yard before leaving. I set up the frame, rails leading off into the distance, rusted cars leaning like crooked tombstones, and clicked. When the photo loaded onto the tiny digital screen, my stomach dropped. The figure was back, this time closer, behind me. It was faint, almost translucent, but the outline was unmistakable. Shoulders, arms, a head that seemed wrong, as though the features had been smeared like wet paint. It wasn't just watching me, it was standing at my shoulder. I spun, my breath caught in my throat. Nothing, just the empty yard. My first instinct was to delete the photo. If I didn't see it again, maybe it would stop haunting me. My thumb hovered over the delete button, but then another thought pressed in. What if this was exactly the kind of spirit of abandonment my professor wanted? What if this was my chance to stand out, to prove that I had captured something none of my classmates could? So I didn't delete it. I slipped the camera into my bag, zipped it up, and hurried out of the yard as fast as my legs would carry me. I didn't look back, not once, though I swear I felt something trailing just behind me the whole way. That night, I uploaded the photos onto my laptop. The earlier ones looked normal, decay, rust, gloom. But as I clicked toward the last batch, my mouth went dry. The figure wasn't just in one or two photos. It appeared in nearly all of them. At first, distant, hazy, almost part of the background. Then gradually closer, frame by frame, until the final shot where it was practically at my side. Each time the face was blurred, as if it didn't want to be seen clearly. Or worse, as if it couldn't be. I shut the laptop, heart thudding, but even with the screen dark I could still picture it. The smudge of a face, the way it leaned closer with every shot, like it knew the camera was my only way of seeing it. I told myself I'd delete the photos in the morning, that sleep would clear my head. But that night, as I lay awake in my room, I caught myself glancing toward the corner where my tripod stood, half expecting to see something waiting there. And when I finally drifted off, I dreamed in flashes of blurred glass and smeared faces pressing close, closer still, until I woke with a gasp. The laptop was open on my desk. I hadn't touched it, and one new image was displayed on the screen. Me, asleep in my bed. I should have left that night. Every instinct told me to grab my camera, shove everything into my backpack, and run until the train tracks were nothing more than a smear of rust in the distance. But I didn't. Curiosity, that same flaw that pushed me to photograph places no one else wanted to, anchored me there. I woke the next morning on the floor of my tiny studio apartment, clutching my camera to my chest like a lifeline. My neck ached, my back throbbed, but worse than that was the heavy dread coiled inside me. I thought it might fade in the daylight, but when I glanced toward the window, I froze. The reflection wasn't mine. It was the blurred face from my photographs, the same smear of glass-like features, warped and indistinct, standing in my place. The rest of the reflection mirrored reality. My couch, my stack of dishes, the blinds half open. But where my reflection should have been, something else stared back. I staggered away, knocking into a chair. By the time I dared to look again, the reflection was normal. Just me, pale, tired, trembling. I didn't touch the camera that day. Didn't dare, but I couldn't ignore it either. The following evening, I decided to delete the photographs for good. I scrolled through them slowly, one by one. First frame, the pale figure at the far end of the yard. Second frame, closer. Third frame, closer still. And then, my breath stopped. There was a new photograph I hadn't taken. It was of me, asleep, on the floor of my apartment. The timestamp read just after midnight, hours after I'd returned from the yard, when the camera had been zipped inside my bag. My heart jackhammered. I dropped the camera onto the bed and stumbled back. That was the moment I realized I wasn't just haunted by an image. I was being watched. I stopped going to classes. I stopped answering texts from friends. Each night I shoved a chair under my doorknob, checked the locks 3 times, and kept the camera hidden under my mattress. But no matter what I did, the photographs changed. More appeared. Me brushing my teeth, me pacing the kitchen, me curled on the floor with the blinds drawn. Always grainy, always from impossible angles, as though the blurred face wasn't just following me but living in my lens, waiting for every chance to look through. The worst came 3 nights later. I woke to the sound of the shutter clicking. Not once, but several times, steady and deliberate, as if someone stood over me taking portraits. I held my breath, paralyzed. The clicking stopped. I waited. Minutes, hours. Finally, I crawled out of bed, every bone in my body shaking. My camera sat on the desk, exactly where I'd left it. The battery light glowed red. I picked it up with numb fingers and checked the screen. 6 new photographs, each one of me in bed, my eyes closed, my mouth slack, my body twisted in fear I hadn't even been aware of. But in the last picture, my eyes were open, half-lidded, staring straight at the lens. I didn't remember waking. I didn't remember looking. I went back to the railway yard the next day, desperate. If this thing started there, maybe I could end it there. The air smelled of rust and weeds, the silence heavier than before. I walked the tracks with my camera clenched in both hands, whispering to myself that it was just a place, just an abandoned yard. But when I reached the spot where I'd taken the first photo, my camera powered on by itself. The screen lit up without me touching it. The lens rotated with a mechanical whir. And then I saw it. Not in front of me, behind me. Through the screen, the blurred face loomed over my shoulder, closer than ever. No shape of a mouth, no outline of eyes, just a warped mess of smeared glass shifting like liquid, leaning in as if to whisper. I spun around. Nothing, only weeds swaying in the breeze. But the camera stayed on. The face stayed in the frame, always behind me. I threw it against the tracks. It shattered, pieces scattering into gravel. I didn't wait to see if the reflection still lingered. I just ran. It didn't matter. That night, my laptop flickered awake on its own. The screen lit my dark apartment, showing folder after folder of new images. My broken camera wasn't gone. It had only found another way through. Hundreds of photos scrolled past. All of me. Brushing my hair, standing in the shower, sleeping in bed. Each picture sharper, clearer, less blurred than before, as if the face had finally learned how to focus. And in the very last photograph, I wasn't alone. I stood in the kitchen, my back to the lens. Behind me, a hand, pale, warped, too long, rested on my shoulder. The next morning, I packed. I didn't care where I went. I just needed to leave. But as I zipped my bag, the blinds rattled. Light flickered across the wall like a shutter opening and closing. I froze. From the corner of the room, my cracked camera lay in pieces. Its lens twitched. Its flash blinked. And then, click. The sound I'd grown to fear more than anything else. The sound that meant it was still watching. Always watching. I was in my final semester of college when I decided to start a photography series that would hopefully land me a spot in the graduating showcase. My professor kept repeating that my work was technically good, but lacking atmosphere. That stung. So when I passed by the abandoned freight station on the edge of town, I thought I had found the perfect subject. The place had been shut down for nearly 30 years. The yard was littered with weeds pushing through cracked asphalt, and the air always smelled faintly metallic, as if rust had seeped into the soil itself. Rows of broken windows stretched along the main depot like blind eyes, and the skeletal remains of tracks ran off into nothing. It was exactly the kind of forgotten landscape I needed. I brought my camera gear on a gray afternoon just before sunset. The light slanted at an angle that gave the whole yard a strange copper hue, which would translate perfectly in black and white. I took shots of the broken rails, of old warning signs leaning sideways, of shattered bottles glittering like teeth along the ground. That's when I noticed it. In one of the frames, behind the row of splintered storage doors, a pale blur appeared. I figured it was just a lens flare, maybe even dust reflecting off the cracked glass. But when I zoomed in, it looked disturbingly like a face, elongated, featureless, almost pressed against the lens itself. I told myself it was nothing. That's what I always do when my brain tries to play tricks on me. I kept shooting. I crouched low for a better angle of the depot doors, the shutter clicking in rapid bursts. Each time I glanced at the preview screen, that pale shape reappeared, closer, at first behind the farthest door, then between the middle set, and finally at the one directly in front of me. Yet when I lowered the camera, there was nothing there, just shadows and peeling paint. The air grew heavier, as though the whole yard was holding its breath. My heart thudded against my ribs, and I forced myself to keep working. Maybe if I finished the roll, I could convince myself it was a technical error. But the last shot I took broke me. I clicked the shutter, looked down at the preview screen, and froze. The figure wasn't behind a door anymore. It was standing right at my side. The pale blur had taken on a more solid shape, with the impression of shoulders, a head tilted slightly, and something dark where the mouth should have been. The moment I lifted my head, no one was there. The yard was silent except for the whistle of distant wind. I packed up fast, hands shaking as I shoved lenses and filters into my bag without care. I didn't even look back at the depot. The whole walk home, though, I had the sickening sensation of being trailed, of something just out of view lingering in step with me. At my apartment, I sat down at my desk and immediately connected the camera to my laptop. I needed to see the files on a bigger screen. Maybe my paranoia was just feeding into a trick of exposure, but the images were worse than I expected. The figure showed up in almost every single frame after the first few, each time a little sharper, a little more defined. In one photo, it seemed to be leaning forward as though about to whisper in my ear. In another, its head was tilted so far it looked broken at the neck. I deleted them. I didn't even stop to hesitate. Highlighted the folder, pressed delete, emptied the recycle bin. But when I looked up at my monitor again, a single file remained. Its thumbnail glowed brighter than the rest, as if the screen itself wanted to draw my attention. I clicked it. The photo filled the screen, high resolution, impossible to misinterpret. It was me, sitting exactly where I was at that very moment, hands on the keyboard, eyes wide, and behind me, leaning over my shoulder, was the pale figure. Its face hovered inches from mine, blurred and smeared, like wet paint dragged across glass. I spun around so fast my chair toppled. The room was empty. Only the faint creak of the window frame filled the silence. That was the first night I didn't sleep. For the next few days, I tried convincing myself it was stress. Finals, projects, lack of sleep. It could all make someone see things. That's what I kept repeating. But the more I ignored it, the more it seemed to demand my attention. Every reflective surface turned against me. The mirror above my sink would flicker at the corner of my vision, showing a blur that never matched my movements. The dark gloss of my laptop screen, even when powered down, sometimes hinted at a second shape in the room. I stopped taking photographs. Even picking up the camera made my chest seize with panic. But then the images started coming back. At first they were hidden deep in my hard drive, folders I never created, filled with dozens of photos of me in my own apartment. Some showed me asleep in bed, others sitting at my desk, and some captured moments I couldn't even remember living. Each file was time-stamped at hours I knew I had been home alone. When I deleted them, they returned the next day. Different angles, closer frames. Then came the sounds. At night, while lying awake in the half-dark, I would hear the soft, mechanical click of a shutter echo through the room. Not from my camera, which I'd locked away, but from somewhere just out of reach. Sometimes it came from the corner by the closet, other times from directly above my headboard. The worst part was that every time I checked my computer the next morning, there were new photos waiting. The figure wasn't blurry anymore. Its face was smeared and stretched, yes, but the details were clearer. The hollows where eyes should have been, the impossible bend of its jaw, the slick shine of its skin, and always, it was closer. One night I couldn't take it anymore. I unplugged my computer, pulled the camera apart piece by piece, and dumped everything into the trash chute. The hollow clatter of plastic and metal hitting the bottom was strangely satisfying, like exorcising something rotten. But at 3 a.m, I woke to the sound of the shutter again. Slow, deliberate, click, click, click. I turned on the lamp with trembling hands, and my phone buzzed on the nightstand. The screen lit up with a notification. New photos added to gallery. I didn't even remember opening the app, but when I glanced down, the photos were already there. Dozens of them. The first few showed me curled up in bed, eyes squeezed shut in fear. The last one was live. I watched as the image shifted, my own sleeping body, my own shallow breaths caught frame by frame. And then, with stomach-dropping clarity, a pale hand reached into the frame and pulled the blanket from my chest. I bolted upright, gasping, clutching the sheets around me. But they were already gone, lying crumpled on the floor. The air was icy. My window was still latched shut. That was when I realized it didn't matter if I destroyed the camera. It didn't matter if I smashed the laptop or burned the phone. The figure wasn't attached to the equipment. It had crawled past the glass, past the lens, and now it was here, living in the silence between the clicks. That night, I packed a bag and left. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't want to explain something that sounded so insane. I drove until morning, checked into a roadside motel, and tried to believe I'd left it behind. But as I set my bag on the bed and glanced toward the dresser mirror, my stomach dropped. A Polaroid was taped to the glass. It showed me entering the room only seconds earlier, and behind me, blurred but grinning wide enough to split its face, was the figure.